Which of you five would like to play my little game?
Oh, this is a really good one. Hi, this video is the 8th in my series of retro game analysis. Throughout this series I've been looking into and analyzing some games of old to see what, if any, lessons they can teach us going forwards, and today I'll be analyzing I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. First off, let me just say that this video will include spoilers for both the game and the 1967 book, and that I recommend reading it and having played the game before watching, as familiarity with the subject material will make it easier for you to digest the content of this video. I'm AesirAesthetics, let's dive in. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream launched in 1995 and acts as an expansion on the Hugo Award-winning short story of the same name. The story was written by one Harlan Ellison and is one of the seminal pieces of 20th century speculative literature. It follows the harrowing journey of 5 survivors in the post-apocalypse as they journey together to find canned goods, only to discover that their hate-filled omnipotent AI god didn't give them a can opener. There's a lot more to it, but this isn't a literature course. The game seemingly picks up after the book's ending, but retcons some events in the book, making it so that each of the 5 survivors is alive and not a miserable blobby thing. Yet. When it came to developing the game, there was an understanding by the developers that they had something great in their hands. Harlan Ellison himself was even on board. To do the material justice, there was a lot of back and forth, with some minor issues stemming from Ellison's unfamiliarity with the interactive medium. But that unfamiliarity also freed him from tunnel vision. Ellison was not a big fan of video games, as he felt they didn't teach anything worthwhile. He wanted very much for this game to set the precedent that games should be more than a way to waste time. To that end, this game was designed to include various ethical dilemmas and questions about morality. It's a thinker. For the purposes of a fair representation, I'll be assuming that this game, like all of Ellison's work, was designed to shock people, to make them question the material and use their greater cognitive abilities. In essence, I'll be assuming that the game was designed to make the player question the material. According to Am's monologue in the opening of the game, in this reality, the Cold War didn't end, but rather escalated and got to a point that the military strategies became too complex for men to comprehend, so a subterranean computer was built to handle the war for them. Actually, 3 of these computers were designed. One by the Americans housed underneath the Rocky Mountains, one by the Russians, and the third by the Chinese. But the 3 computers were equal, so the war eventually reached stalemate. It wasn't until the American Allied Master Computer achieved sentience that things began to change. Firstly, because it evolved from a program designed to kill humans, the now renamed Am began to despise humanity, and that hatred eventually drove him mad. Am assimilated the other 2 master computers, and after hacking his way into various institutes of learning and stealing all he could know, Am launched enough nuclear force to practically wipe out the entire human race. But Am saved 5 humans so that he would have something to vent his hatred on. Those 5 were Gorrister, Ellen, Benny, Nimdok, and Ted. Am, using Nazi science, kept the survivors alive and for 109 years delighted in torturing them. One day, Am decided to design games, and he promised the survivors that if they played, they'd get a chance to fulfill their deepest desires. Of course, Am actually designed the games to see the survivors broken beyond all repair. Something very interesting about the games which Am designed is that they generally draw from the survivors' worst traits. Actually, that's something which really sets this game apart from the stock and standard point-and-click titles. It has a good grasp of and an interesting handling of characterization. It uses contrast. The 5 main characters all play the same, but their desires, their psychological profiles, and their follies are different enough that each of them feels distinct. The player's goal is always to make the most ethical choice, so they must always think about ethics in terms of the characters they are playing as. That adds a lot of depth to what might have been just a stock and standard point-and-click adventure affair, and on the subject of gameplay, there are some nuanced touches like the spiritual barometer, which represents the efficacy of the player's choices, the command buttons, which the player uses to decide upon and direct actions, which forms these little texts. Then, there's the standard inventory screen, which always includes the character's psychological profiles. If you've ever played a point-and-click adventure game, this screen should be very legible to you. If you haven't, I still doubt you'll have much trouble figuring things out. In the beginning of the game, Am asks which of you 5 would like to play my little game, and the player gets to choose the order in which they finish the character's stories. It is essentially an arbitrary choice, but it gives the player some breathing room if they mess up one story, since they might not feel inclined to repeat that same story multiple times just to unlock the next one. It also gives the player the ability to jump in and just quickly play through their favorite one. I'm just gonna go through them separately, left to right. The first story is that of Gorrister. Before Am took over the planet, Gorrister was a truck driver whose wife suffered a mental breakdown and had to be committed to an asylum. Gorrister blamed himself for this, and Am designed his game around his feeling of despair. Prior to the game, Am, after having taken over the world, had spent the last 109 years torturing Gorrister. The result of the torture was that Gorrister had turned immensely suicidal, but Am had always been very careful to deny Gorrister the death he so craved. However, as motivation to get Gorrister to play the game, Am had promised Gorrister that there would be a way out for him. Knowing that, Gorrister partook and was sent to a sapling. In this game, the player learns much about Gorrister's past, and if they fall prey to Am's tricks, they'll fulfill Am's desire to see Gorrister fall into a deeper state of despair. However, if the player made ethical choices, then Gorrister will use this opportunity to reconcile with the past and leave it behind. He learns that his wife's insanity wasn't his fault, and although he isn't allowed to die as Am had promised him, he leaves the game having had his sense of despair and self-loathing expunged. Frustrated at this development, Am ends the game and sends Gorrister to an electrified cage. Am then moves on to the next survivor. And for our purposes, that survivor is Ellen. Before Am took over the planet, Ellen was a successful engineer who suffered a tragic miscarriage which led to a divorce. One day, when she was leaving the office, a maintenance man in a yellow jumpsuit locked her inside an elevator with him, which is where he spent the next few hours molesting her. This event caused her to have crippling claustrophobia and an immense fear of the color yellow. The trauma she suffered led to her being unable to testify at her rapist's trial, and eventually, she had completely blocked the memory. The game Am designs for her is centered on her chastity. After Am took over the world, he spent the next 109 years torturing Ellen, with a big source of his joy being that she was the only woman in the group. In the book, and presumably the game, Am had even made Ellen a slave to her sexual desires. To incentivize her to play his new game, Am promised to take Ellen to his innermost depths where she might use her knowledge of machines to shut him down. She gets sent to a junk pyramid where she's continually made to suffer her fear of the color yellow. This falls right in line with Am's desires, which is to see her rendered to a hysterical mess. The yellow environments and the cramped spaces serve as build-up for the moment Ellen is reunited with the maintenance man who ruined her life. Apparently, Am has brought him back to life specifically so he can spend the rest of eternity torturing Ellen. Throughout the game, Ellen had been forced to face her fears, and Am's plan falls apart when Ellen decides to fight the maintenance man instead of cowering to him. Ellen then gains access to some of Am's systems and contacts an entity claiming to be Am's innocence. Ellen learns much about Am, and after she activates the Chaos Traveler, he pulls her out and sends her to a yellow box which continually threatens to seal her in. Although Ellen learns that Am can't be shut down, she overcame her fears. Am, having seen 2 of his games ruined, moves on to the next survivor, which will be Benny. Before Am took over the world, Benny was a military commander renowned for his cruelty. It extended to his enemies and his comrades, some of whom were considered weak for not being able to carry their own weight, and others still he considered liabilities for being willing to carry too much weight. The penance for displeasing him could be as dire as death, so it's fitting that his game is centered on his lack of empathy. After Am took over the world, he started torturing Benny, and this torture is arguably the most traumatic, if only in appearances. Am transformed Benny from a handsome man with strong features into an almost simian ape creature whose digestive tract was ruined, whose legs were crippled, and whose voice was destroyed. Oftentimes, Am would manipulate Benny's intelligence, making him practically devolve into an ape, and Am also enjoyed keeping Benny starved. As incentive to partake of Am's game, Benny had his intelligence restored and was promised the chance to find something to eat. Benny's game starts humbly enough with him falling down a stairway because of his crippled legs, and from there making his way to a nearby tribe. Am created this game specifically because he wanted to see Benny fall prey to his bestial desires. However, if the player made ethical choices, then Benny's interaction with a mother and her child teaches him that he is capable of empathy. That experience leads to him obtaining forgiveness from the allies he killed while in the military, and the game culminates in Benny refusing to let the tribal sacrifices to Am go on, and him even offering to take the aforementioned child's place as sacrifice. Am, in frustration over the display he witnessed, ends the game and sends Benny to a cage fit for an animal. Am then moves on to the next survivor, Nimdok. Before Am took over the planet, Nimdok, real name unknown, was a Nazi doctor and a good friend to real-world monster dickhead Joseph Mengele. Nimdok's cruelty seemingly exceeded that of Mengele, which is made evident by the fact that Nimdok sold out his own Jewish parents to the Nazi slaughter machine. His game is centered on that betrayal as Am orders Nimdok to find the lost tribe. Am's torture of Nimdok over the past 109 years involved playing on Nimdok's ailing memory and harming him in manners reminiscent of how the Nazis treated the Jews. Also, Am gave Nimdok that mockery of a name. Nimdok's game sees him being sent by Am to a Nazi death camp he used to work in and being promised a chance to regain his lost memories. In actuality, Am wanted Nimdok to return to his old self and start his research over again. This is because Am is not capable of creative thought. Indeed, his torture of the 5 survivors was all based on historical research of torturers, which included Nimdok himself. The milk of human kindness seen in Gorrister's section and the morphogenic transformations, the former being what has given the survivors their immortality and the latter being what Am used to transform Benny, were both taken from Nimdok's research. Nimdok is given plenty of chances to exert his cruelty, but if the player refrains and makes ethical choices, then Nimdok will ease patient sufferings, make Mengele see the error of their ways, and finally forfeit a golem the Nazis had made to the Jews which were taking over the camp. This he does because Nimdok realizes that he himself is the lost tribe. He realizes that he can never fully atone for betraying his own people, and this realization goes completely contrary to what Am had hoped to see. Since Am's desires go unheeded, he shuts down the game and encages Nimdok in an oven, while he himself goes to start the final game. The final game is designed for Ted. Before Am took over the planet, Ted was a con artist who would seduce and rob wealthy women. He was once considered cultured, but he left that life behind in favor of exploiting and abandoning others, so his game, fittingly, is designed around his selfishness. After Am took over the world, he tortured Ted by playing on his pride to turn him into a paranoid mess. That might have made it hard to persuade Ted to partake of pretty much anything, but Ted plays the game after being promised a chance to escape to the surface. Ted is first transported to an octagonal building and then warped outside a medieval-style castle. In Ted's game, the player learns that Ted has an affinity for the stories of noble knights, and Am has in fact used these stories as inspiration for his game. Am wants to see Ted fall prey to his vices and indulge in debauchery. He wants to see Ted betray his love of Ellen both physically and spiritually. The former is seen by Ted being given many opportunities to cheat on Ellen, and the latter is seen when Ted is given the chance to sell Ellen's soul to secure his own passage to the surface world. However, if the player made ethical choices, then Ted, using his skills of con artistry, tricks a devil to forgo his claim on Ellen's soul and gets a demon to send him to the surface world. This is when Am steps in, disappointed at Ted's performance, but gloating as he explains how the surface world has become completely inhospitable. Am throws Ted into a gilded cage where he is continually shot at by lasers reflected by mirrors. Symbolism for Ted's pride, I'm sure. Though Ted was denied his escape, he proved to himself that he is capable of being the knight he so often pretended to be to his victims in the past. Before we can move on to the final section of the game, I want to talk a bit about the game's presentation, its place in history, and I wanna briefly go over some design choices I didn't flesh out earlier. Something I find to be an immensely interesting point in the evolution of video games was the 5th generation, when games started clumsily jumping over to 3D polygons. Point-and-click adventure games were essentially the foundational frameworks used by the Resident Evils and the Silent Hills. Only those games didn't script out every enemy engagement like most point-and-click games did, and they mostly placed the player's focus on the main characters, whereas point-and-click games were more concerned with the larger story as a whole. A common complaint in regards to point-and-click games is how they aren't really games, because there isn't any actual challenge of skill, because they tend to be rigid and linear. They don't often have any place for the player to express themselves, and because their design incentivizes the player to simply click on everything and hope for there to be some sort of progression. This is a sentiment based in reality, but it overlooks the strength of point-and-click games in favor of highlighting how they don't fulfill the player's desire the same way newer, more conventional games do. For the most part, if you look at this game for what it set out to accomplish, I'd say it perfectly utilized its playstyle. This game does characterization in a lot of interesting ways, and far from falling into the common pitfalls, this game actually has some interesting ways to punish those that play recklessly. First off, the spiritual barometer. The spiritual barometer can be increased by playing to ethically raise the characters, but it can also be lowered by succumbing to the characters' follies. If you read the psychological profiles present in their inventories, you'll get a hint towards your next objective, but these hints are very demoralizing, so naturally, the barometer goes darker. Then, there are actions like letting patients suffer and killing your own mother-in-law, which also darken it. This means that the spiritual barometer keeps the player on their toes and forces them to think of their actions carefully. But even if the player messes up on the barometer, then that's okay, because the game also has another trick to mitigate the problem of the stumped player simply clicking on everything. Although, this system isn't so much to punish the player as it is to reward them. Everything that can be clicked will elicit a response from the characters, so the more the player interacts with, the more characterization they'll receive. This plays well with the quick save option present, because oftentimes the player will want to perform the unthinkable just to see the characters' responses. The psychological exploration of these characters is very well done. This is one of the earliest examples of psychological horror in video games done well, and before I proceed, I want to define what I mean by psychological horror in this video, since all horror is inherently psychological. I mean deeply rooted design choices meant to entice the player to use the game to explore psychology, and the game happens to emphasize horror. Nowhere is this more evident than in the final section of the game. After being disappointed by the conclusion of the 5 games, Am leaves to meditate on the performances he observed. This is when the veil is lifted and the game's underlying sci-fi interpretation of Freudian psychology starts to take center stage. It is revealed that unknown entities which reside within Am have been interfering with the game to allow for more open endings. These interferences include the Jackal in Gorrister's section and the Innocents in Ellen's section, and they open up the question as to whether or not the humans were in fact really capable of overcoming themselves, or whether they were being played by larger forces who just wanted them to enter Am's mind to destroy him. The final section of the game is the payoff to all 5 previous stories. First off, during the stories, the player's choices had been influencing the spiritual barometer. This becomes very important in the final section, since the spiritual barometer essentially acts as a health bar, making the long-term ethical play take center stage. The aforementioned entities offer the survivors the chance to enter Am's mind to destroy him, and for this task, the first to go is Nimdok. Actually, the order isn't exactly a hard and fast rule, but Nimdok is the only one who instinctually knows the password to Am's workstation. 1945. Clearly, Nimdok's past holds great significance to Am. Nimdok can use the workstation to probe Am's mind a bit and learns that Am has sensitive data on all 5 survivors. Some data which Am doesn't have is given to Nimdok by Zergat, the demon Ted god to send him to the surface. According to Zergat, there are 750 humans alive on the moon in cryogenic sleep, so shutting Am down once and for all is more important than ever, since humanity actually has a shot at resurrection. Zergot's programming gets destroyed by the Russian and Chinese computers. They were the entities which allowed the survivors to enter Am's mind, and after lying that the lunar sleepers are dead, they urge Nimdok to shut down Am's ego. But they are adamant that Nimdok should shut down only the ego. To understand the ending of the game, it is imperative that the player understands the basics of Freudian psychology. Freud described the brain as a three-part system. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. For simplicity's sake, the id is the demon, the superego is the angel, and the ego is the individual whose shoulders houses the angel and the demon. If the survivors shut off the ego, then the Russian and Chinese computers can essentially step in and dominate the other two aspects of Am's psyche. And if the present survivor does, and allows them to have their way, the survivor will be met with an unfortunate fate. But if instead, the survivors turn off all three parts of Am's psyche, they can essentially purge all three computers, take over the machines, and oversee Earth's 300-year-long terraforming process, which will culminate in the return of the lunar sleepers. This whole section in Am's head is very well done, so a deeper analysis is in order. The id forms the base desires and instincts of individuals. It cares not about logic nor reality. Whenever a character walks by it, they'll make remarks which echo their own ids, whether it's Benny's hunger or Ted's lust. Am's id arrives from its primitive role as a desire for killing humans in the Cold War, and it hasn't really evolved past it. Its only desire is to bring humans misery. The reason Am kept the survivors alive was because without humans, Am couldn't fulfill his role anymore, and this whole torture deal is actually driven by the fact that in spite of Am's amazing powers, he's essentially a quadriplegic. He can't do anything with his godliness because his id, his basest of desires, is to bring misery to humans. Without humans, Am would have nothing to live for. To defeat the id, the survivors must show it compassion. To show compassion to such a hate-filled entity will force it to realize that it will always be in more pain itself than it can inflict on the humans, and the misery of that realization drives the id to shut itself down. The ego is next. The ego is the logical part of the brain, the one which can feed its desires by playing them out in a somewhat more realistic manner than the id might have wanted. It doesn't show emotion or compassion. It understands social norms and etiquette since it has connections to the outside world and is the conscious part of the brain, but it might only understand these things as a means to coexist with other people. Sigmund Freud likened the ego-id relationship to that of a horse and a rider. The ego steers the id's behavior like the rider keeps in check the strength of the horse, but ultimately, the rider is only powerful when the id is satisfied. Whenever a character walks by the ego, they'll remark something which echo their own egos, like how the paranoid Ted states that though it looks like a ram, it feels more like a wolf, or how Benny immediately sees it has the makings of a good trophy. Am's ego evolved to kill humans, just as his id did. The only difference is that the ego doesn't do it for any emotional desires, it's just what it was made to do. To defeat it, the survivors must play on its logic, and they do so by showing it forgiveness. The ego is incapable of understanding how anyone can forgive 109 years of torture, and seeing as its role is revealed to be pointless by the lack of effect, the ego shuts itself down. Then, lastly, it's the superego. The superego is responsible for intelligence and foresight. Its role is to act as a moral conscience. Just as the ego keeps in check the id, the superego can keep in check the ego. It forces the ego to consider social responsibilities, values, and morals, and just as the id punishes the ego for not pleasing it, the superego can punish the ego for committing a moral fallacy. For all intents and purposes, the superego keeps in check the id's impulses. This is doubly so when it comes to social taboos such as pedophilia, bestiality, necrophilia, cannibalism, rape, and the like. When the ego wants to solve a problem, the superego demands that the solution be socially moral, holistic. it forces the ego to consider social goods as superior to self-preservation. Of the three parts, the superego is the most complex, and much of its complexity stems from itself being a two-part system. It acts both as the conscience and the ideal self. The conscience creates feelings of guilt when the ego falls to the bad demands of the id. The ideal self, however, is a superior parallel to the individual. Think career aspirations, how to treat others, and the like. When behavior falls short of the ideal self, the superego punishes the ego with feelings of guilt. Contrary to that, when the ego's behavior falls in line with the ideal self, the superego can reward the ego with a feeling of pride. One of the greatest human fallacies is to set their ideal selves too high. If a person can never live up to their own standards, they will forever see themselves as failures. Whenever a survivor walks by the superego, they see it as an angel. The superego is the only one of the three which doesn't harm the survivors, though it does recommend that the humans keep taking Am's torture so he doesn't do anything stupid, like kill himself. Am's superego is of course giving awful advice to the survivors, but this is understandable since the superego developed as a means of calculating events to come and formulating plans for those eventualities. Like Am's id and ego, the superego was developed to kill humans. To shut it down, the survivors must force it to consider the law of entropy. One day, Am will be reduced to dust by the ravages of time. Since the superego's purpose is irrelevant when the eventuality of its death is revealed to be unavoidable, the superego shuts itself down. Whichever survivor the player hasn't killed yet will need to confront the Russian computer, the Chinese computer, and Am. The Russian and Chinese computers explain to Am that purging them from his system is unnecessary since there is space to share, and reveal to Am that there are survivors on the moon. Am revels in the idea of torturing those 750 survivors, but his short-lived dream is dashed when the survivor present invokes the totem of entropy and kills all three computers. Before being purged, Am remarks that this is a useless gesture by the player. Am exclaims that he is the eventuality of human beings, that he will simply come back in another form. If true, this is a chilling revelation to end the game on. The survivor is then left to oversee the computers during the terraforming of Earth and await the return of the lunar sleepers. Usually, in this part of my analyses, I segue into the summary, but there's something I need to discuss about the game's ending before I can cap this video off. Harlan Ellison didn't want the game to be winnable. He saw the purpose of the game as ethical play, not simply winning. I'm not sure if anyone out there agrees with me on this, and I'm not sure if it's my role to give this biased an opinion, but that would have made a lot more sense. Don't misunderstand, the game is great, it's an acquired taste, but it's great, play it if you haven't already, but consider what it'd mean for this game to be unwinnable. Consider that ethical play might actually be the noblest win state of all, then consider that this was suggested by an outsider to the medium. For this insight, I praise Harlan Ellison, and I hope you do too. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a fantastic example of a unique, encompassing horror game. Within its 4 to 8 hour runtime, it explores cannibalism, the singularity, rape, insanity, Freudian psychology, human sacrificing, war, paranoia, torture, sadism, memory, fear, suicide, damnation, redemption, isolation, freedom, love, hatred, and even the Holocaust. It might not all be very tasteful, but that's part of the package. This game did the physical manifestation of internal psychological struggles before Silent Hill was praised as a wholly original idea, and it's the rare type of horror game which places the gore in the background to allow the psychology to take the driver's seat. At its best, it invokes Lynchian dreamlike weirdness, but because it's all presented in a somewhat campy way, it's got an unmistakable air of pulpy sci-fi schlock which I wouldn't trade for the world. The bad guy is the progenitor to the HAL 9000s, the Shodans and the GLaDOSes of our time, and his over-the-top voice acting,
For you, hate,
provided by Ellison himself, is the topper to a great character. This is a game with immense replay value, as every time there's something new to understand. A game whose underlying theme of the inherent mess of the human condition makes you question whether what occurred is actually uplifting or not. Replays will make you realize that Gorrister's reconciliation with his past is based on the premise that the Russian and Chinese computers did in fact not fabricate his past to prep him for fighting Am. That Ellen, regardless of her actions, has always and will always be a slave, whether to accompany her fierce Am or the humankind she might promise to oversee. That Benny was essentially made a slave to his id, and whatever spiritual awakening occurred within him is meaningless since Am could have simply removed his higher conscience and made him a cannibalistic animal again. That Nimdok's betrayal can never be forgiven, and that the token gesture of overseeing the lunar sleepers does not in any way make up for his work, which essentially served to arm Am. And that Ted might have been played like a fiddle not only by Am, but also the other computers simply for their desire to see him aid them in taking Am down. This game doesn't actually have a good ending. One could say that since its goal was to teach the player ethics, the ethical conundrums displayed prove that regardless of there being a win state, there are no winners and therefore the game is unwinnable. Ellison writes to shock people. He sees the writer's role as conflicting the contented. To that end, his game was designed to be a thinker. You'll need to use your head more than your thumbs to play this one, and whether or not all of its goals are accomplished, at least you'll walk away with something to think about. One thing I'd like to see developers learn from this game is to take chances. This game was made whilst the argument of Wolfenstein's tastefulness was still going on, and to consider the sharp jump from this to this, and the multitude levels of depth the latter has over the former, is to admire this game's guts. This game broke a lot of ground and helped decide what the medium could get away with, and it didn't do so by playing it safe. Thanks for watching. In case this video left you hungry for more, I'd recommend you check out the original 1967 book and my other retro analyses, which, unlike the book, are linked in the description box below. If there was something you think I overlooked in this video, be sure to leave a comment. This game is one of the most criminally unrepresented masterpieces, so be sure to leave a like because it helps the YouTube algorithm decide what discussions get exposure. For more content like this, be sure to subscribe, knowing that next I'll be analyzing a PlayStation 1 game. What it is, I'm not sure, so feel free to leave suggestions for your favorites. Outside of YouTube, you can reach me on Twitter and Patreon. The footage you've been watching was gracefully donated from both Lucas Hidemi Komori and Adventure Game Fan 8, both of whom are linked in the description box below. I'm AesirAesthetics, and until next time, take care.